wagon stops at a line in the dirt that nobody bothered to mark. No fence, no sign, just a place where the frozen grass gives up and the ground turns to gray ash. "End of the road," the sergeant says. He doesn't look at me when he says it. He's looking at the horses. 6 of us came out on this wagon. 3 got dropped at the labor camp 2 days back. 2 more went into a mining pit yesterday morning, still chained together, still arguing about whose fault it was. I'm the last one left, which either means I'm the worst of them or the least useful, and I haven't decided which. The sergeant walks around the back, pulls the pin on my irons, and they fall into the snow without ceremony. No key, no lecture, just a length of iron chain hitting frozen ground and a man already turning away from it. "Dig your own hole if you want a headstone," he says. "Nobody's coming back for the body." He throws a canvas sack at my feet. It lands heavier than I expect tools from the shape of it and not new ones. Then he's back up on the wagon and the wagon is moving and I'm standing on a line in the dirt watching 6 horses and a driver disappear into gray light without once looking back. I count to 60 before I let myself feel anything about it. Then I stop counting because feeling anything about it isn't going to keep me alive past sundown. I pick up the sack, chisel, hand axe, a coil of wire gone half to rust, a hammer with a cracked haft. Somebody's toolkit once. Somebody who isn't using it anymore. The land past the line doesn't look like a curse. That's the first thing that surprises me. I expected black rock, dead trees, something a storyteller would want. Instead, it's just tired ground, cracked earth, ash-gray grass, a wind that smells like a doused fire a week old, 50 years since anyone drew a border here and called it lost. It looks less like a grave and more like a house nobody's swept. I start walking because standing still won't get me to a wall before dark. The howl comes maybe 10 minutes in. Not one voice, 4, 5, layered on top of each other, close enough that the ground under my boots seems to know it before my ears do. I don't have a weapon. I have a hammer with a cracked haft and a chisel meant for stone, and neither of those wins a fight against a full pack. So I don't plan to fight one. There's a ruin ahead, what used to be a watchtower, half collapsed, one wall still standing at a lean timber scattered like a giant knocked it over and lost interest. I run for it, not because it looks safe, but because it's the only shape on this whole flat stretch of ground that isn't grass. They come out of the gully to my left. 5 of them. Ashen hounds, that's what the wagon guards called them, back when they still bothered talking to me. Gray hides split by cracks that glow a dull orange underneath, like coals wrapped in old leather. Lean, fast, built for chasing things across open ground. I'm on open ground. I get to the ruin 10 strides ahead of the lead hound, and I don't stop. I go straight for the collapsed section, the tangle of fallen beams and cracked stone, because a heartbeat before I even reach it, I already know something I have no business knowing. I can see the wood. Not the way I've always seen wood grain and knots and splinters. I see the load in it. I see which beam is still carrying weight it shouldn't be carrying, propped at an angle that's one hard knock from failing. I see the crack running through the stone footing under it, and I see, with a clarity that makes my stomach drop, exactly what happens if that beam comes down right now, at this angle, onto that narrow gap between the fallen wall and the rock behind it. I don't think about how I know this. There isn't time to think about it. I put my shoulder into the beam. It doesn't take strength. That's the strange part, it barely takes any strength at all, because the beam wasn't waiting to be pushed, it was waiting to fail, and all I do is choose the moment and the angle instead of letting chance choose them. It comes down across the gap with a crack that sounds like the whole ruin agreeing with the decision, and it lands exactly where the thing in my head told me it would land, sealing the wide mouth of the gap down to a gap barely wider than one hound's shoulders. The lead hound doesn't stop in time. It hits the narrow gap at full speed and the beam catches it across the back, not crushing it, just enough to slow it, wedge it, turn it into a plug and a bottleneck. The second hound piles into the first. Then the third piles into both of them, snapping and snarling, trying to climb over its own pack to reach me. And the narrow stone funnel does what narrow stone funnels do. It turns 5 separate animals into one tangled, screaming mess that can't get its claws under itself. I grab the hammer with the cracked haft, and I don't hit anything cleanly, and it doesn't matter, because they're not fighting me anymore. They're fighting each other for the 2 feet of space the gap allows. And that fight is worse for them than anything I could have done with a weapon 3 times better than this one. It takes longer than I'd like. It's uglier than I'd like. When it's over, there are 5 dead animals wedged into a gap in a ruin, and I'm standing over them breathing like I ran here from the wagon road, and my hands won't stop shaking, even though the fight's been done for almost a minute. So that's how this works, I say out loud, to nobody. Nobody answers. Then something small and metal drops out of the collapsed section above me and lands on my shoulder with a weight I wasn't braced for, and I nearly go down onto the dead hounds trying not to flinch it off. "Congratulations," says the something small and metal. "You've killed 5 dogs with a beam and a very stupid amount of luck." It's shaped like a raven if a raven were made of hinged iron plates and had eyes like 2 dull coins. It sits on my shoulder like it owns the spot. "You've been in there the whole time," I say. "I've been in there for considerably longer than the whole time you've been alive," it says. "I was your father's. Now, apparently, I'm yours because nobody else came to collect me, and I'm not walking to the Capitol on these legs. My father's, Carol Vantry, architect mage, third of his line to carry the gift and the last one anybody bothered writing down before the family decided the gift wasn't worth the ink." It taps its beak against the side of my head, once, unpleasantly precise. "You've got his eyes for structure. I watched you find that failure point in under 4 seconds. He needed 6, and he had 30 years of practice on you. Nobody told me what he did, only what he didn't do. Didn't burn anything. Didn't summon anything with teeth. Didn't win a single duel in his life, and in this family that's the only category that counts. The bird thing, it doesn't offer a proper name, so in my head it becomes what it looks like it should be called. A bent iron nail with opinions climbs down my arm and perches on the sack of tools instead. He read buildings the way you just read that tower. He could tell you which wall was lying to you before it fell on your head. Kingdom decided that was a party trick. Kingdom's wrong about a great many things, but you'll notice it's still the one with the throne. And he ended up here. He ended up dead of a fever 3 winters back, in a rented room, with a family that called him an embarrassment right up to the funeral and skipped the funeral anyway. No warmth in the voice at all, and somehow that makes it worse to hear, not better. You ended up here because you're his, and this family doesn't forgive blood for having opinions about violence. I look at the dead hounds, at the collapsed tower that did most of the killing for me, at my own hands which built nothing and broke nothing and simply understood a shape well enough to move it half a foot to the left. "Rebuild a city with my bare hands on a graveyard," the Iron Bird says, apparently reading something on my face I didn't know I was showing. Wonderful plan. Truly inspired. I look forward to watching it fail in a manner that's at least interesting. I haven't said anything about a city. You didn't have to. I've known you for 4 minutes, and I can already tell you're your father's son in all the ways that get a man killed slowly instead of quickly. It settles onto the sack like the conversation is finished, though its coin eyes stay fixed on me. Name's not important right now. Call me Nail if you need to call me something. Walk. Standing over dead dogs philosophizing won't get you a roof before dark. I pick up the sack and Nail rides on top of it, and we walk. The land keeps its word about being tired. No more howls, no more shapes moving at the edge of the gray, just wind and cracked ground and the occasional stretch where the grass has given up entirely and left bare, pale earth that looks scorched from underneath rather than above. Nail talks in bursts and silences, filling gaps I don't ask him to fill. What a gift like mine actually reads. Why nobody trains it because nobody bothers to survive long enough to be trained. Why the family sent me here instead of anywhere useful, because useful would have required someone admitting the gift might be worth something, and admitting that was never on the table. By the time the light starts dying, I can see it a smear of smoke against the gray sky, low walls, the shape of a palisade holding a huddle of roofs together. Somebody's still alive out here. Somebody built a wall to prove it. I pick up my pace. Nail doesn't. They've seen the smoke off your own tower fight. If that fire on your shoulder throws light the way I think it did, Nail says, they'll have seen you coming for the last mile. He's right. By the time I'm close enough to make out the gate, it's already shut, a heavy timber thing, freshly reinforced with mismatched planks, the kind of patchwork that says this village has been shutting that gate against threats for longer than it's had proper wood to do it with. Along the top of the wall, silhouettes stand with the unmistakable shape of pitchforks and one old spear held by someone who clearly isn't used to holding it. Nobody calls out a welcome. Nobody calls out anything at all. I stop a stone's throw from the gate, sack in one hand, and I stand there in the last gray light with a dead man's tools and a dead man's bird and absolutely nothing else. waiting to find out whether this is the part where they let me in or the part where I sleep outside the wall and hope the next pack of hounds isn't as generous with the warning howl as the last one was. Nobody opens the gate. A woman's voice comes over the wall instead, flat and tired in a way that tells me she said these words before to someone who looked a lot like me. "You're the new one," she says. It isn't a question. I'm the only one, I say. There wasn't a line to be new in. A shape leans out over the top of the wall, gray hair pulled back hard, a face that's spent 50 winters deciding not to trust anyone new. This is the first look I get at Marta, and it isn't a friendly one. "Let me guess," she says. "Sent by the crown. Here to take up the post of warden, collect your title, write your report, and be gone by spring." Nobody sent me a title. They never do out loud. It's implied in the paperwork you'll fill in when you leave. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't need to, it carries fine over the quiet. "We've had 4 of you in 11 years. 1 left after a week. 1 left after a bad night with the hounds. 2 didn't bother waiting for a bad night, they just looked at the wall and turned around. I didn't turn around, you will." She says it the way you'd tell someone it's going to rain. "Sleep outside if you want. We don't open that gate for strangers after dark, title or none." She's gone before I can answer that. The pitchforks along the wall don't move, which I take as a fair warning rather than an insult. 8 people holding a village together with farm tools don't owe a stranger the benefit of the doubt, just because he arrived on foot instead of horseback. Nail, still riding the sack, doesn't wait long to comment. Charming reception, she's not wrong about anything she said. "No," he agrees. "That's what makes it charming." I find a lean of wall outside the palisade that blocks the worst of the wind, and I sit with my back against cold timber and the sack of tools across my knees. And I do the only useful thing available to me, which is nothing at all. I'm still hollowed out from the tower, whatever that reading cost me. Back at the ruin, it hasn't come back yet, and I can feel the edges of it like a held breath I can't quite let go of. It's close to midnight when I hear it. Not a howl this time, a sound from inside the wall, low and wrong, water moving somewhere it shouldn't move that way. A gurgle that goes on too long and then chokes off entirely. I'm on my feet before I decide to be. Nail's coin eyes are already fixed toward the sound. "Well," he says, "that's the well failing." "How do you know that from here?" "Because I can hear groundwater losing a fight it's been losing slowly for 50 years, and tonight it's losing faster." He doesn't sound alarmed. He sounds like he's reading a ledger. The crack under this village breathes. "Most nights, it's asleep. Tonight it isn't. Give it 3-4 days at this rate, and that well runs black. And a village with a black well doesn't last the season." I look at the wall, at the shut gate, at the dark shapes of roofs beyond it where 8 people are sleeping through the sound of their only water source failing because nobody's told them yet. Nobody asked me to fix this. Nobody let me in far enough to try. I go to the wall anyway. There's a gap where the palisade meets a collapsed section of old stone foundation, not an opening exactly. More a place where 50 years of neglect left a seam nobody bothered closing because nobody expected anyone determined enough to use it. I go through sideways, sack first, nail flying ahead of me, low and silent. The well sits in the middle of a bare dirt yard, ringed by dark houses. I put my hand against the stone lip of it and I let the reading come, the same way it came at the tower, except this time it's not wood and load-bearing angles. It's something underneath the stone itself, cracks running down through bedrock like old scars that never healed right. And somewhere far below, a thin thread of wrongness bleeding up into clean water and staining it. "Don't touch the source," Nail says. "Quiet now, all business. You go near the crack itself with what you've got left in you. It'll take more than you can afford to give back tonight." I'm not going near the source. I'm going around it. I can see it the way I saw the beam, not a full picture, just the next true thing. The wrongness isn't coming up evenly. It's finding the weakest lines in the stone and following them, the same way water finds the lowest ground. If I can give it a lower ground that isn't the well itself, a ring of worked stone set at the right angles, cut along the lines the crack already wants to follow, instead of against them, it'll bleed off sideways into ground that doesn't matter instead of up into the water that does. It isn't fast work. My hands remember what the sack of tools is for, at least chisel, hammer, the coil of wire, and stone dragged up from the collapsed foundation nearby, because I'm not walking back out through that gap to find better material tonight. Every piece has to sit exactly where the reading says it sits, angled exactly right, or the ring does nothing, and I've wasted the only night I had to prove I'm not the fifth warden who turns around. I'm most of the way through the second course of stone, hands raw, when I notice I'm not alone in the yard. A boy's crouched against the nearest house, close enough to have been watching for a while, far enough to run if he needed to. 16 maybe. He doesn't say anything, doesn't call out for anyone, just watches me work with an attention that isn't fear and isn't quite trust either, something more like a person doing the arithmetic on a stranger before deciding what to do about him. You should be asleep, I say, not stopping. Everyone's asleep. That's the problem. He says it like it explains something. You heard the well too. I heard it fail. It's failed before. Slower. Marta says it's been going bad for years, just not this fast. He edges a little closer, eyes on the stones instead of me now, watching where I place each one. What are you doing? Giving the bad water somewhere to go that isn't up. He doesn't ask how. He watches instead, and after a while he starts handing me stone before I reach for it, which means he's not just watching the placement, he's following the pattern well enough to guess the next piece, and he guesses right more often than not. I'm Yaren, he says at some point between one stone and the next, like it only occurred to him that this was a conversation, and conversations usually have names in them. Corvus. Nail, says Nail from the top of the well without being asked. Yaren looks at the iron bird for exactly as long as it takes to decide not to ask about it either, which I respect more than I expected to. We work through most of the night. The ring closes slow, stone by stone, and somewhere past the middle of it, I feel the thread of wrongness catch on the pattern the way I meant it to, not stopped, just redirected, bled sideways into dead ground where it can do whatever it wants without touching what comes up the well shaft. Whatever's left of what the tower cost me runs out somewhere in that last course of stone, and I keep working anyway, on the kind of stubbornness that doesn't ask the body's permission. By the time the sky starts going gray at the edges instead of black, the ring is closed. I lower a bucket down the shaft, more out of needing to know than needing water right now, and pull it back up clear. Not clean for here clear, actually clear, the kind of water that doesn't smell like something dying underground. Yaren stares at the bucket like it's done something impossible, which to him, it has. Marta finds us at first proper light. She doesn't say anything when she sees the ring of new stone around the well, or the state of my hands, or the boy standing beside a stranger like he's already decided something about him. She walks to the well, pulls up her own bucket, and looks at the water for a long moment without a single word. Then she looks at me. Not warm, not thankful, not out loud. But something in the flat certainty from last night has cracked a little, the same way the crack under this village has just been told, quietly and firmly, to bleed somewhere else for a change. Come inside the wall, she says. Before you fall over where you're standing, it isn't gratitude, it's closer to a debt she doesn't like owing. But it's the gate opening, and it's the first thing in this whole cursed stretch of country that's gone the way I wanted it to. Inside the wall, Ashfall doesn't look like much more than the outside promised a dozen houses, half of them patched together from the bones of houses that didn't make it, and 8 people who watch me the way you'd watch a stray dog that hasn't bitten anyone yet but hasn't earned trust either. Marta gives me a room that used to belong to someone who isn't here anymore. She doesn't say who. I don't ask. You're not the warden, she tells me first morning, standing in the doorway like she still hasn't decided whether to let the words settle. Wardens get quarters at the manor house, if there was a manor house, and a stipend, if there was a treasury. You fixed a well. That buys you a roof. It doesn't buy you a title. I didn't ask for one. Good. Keep not asking. She leaves before I can say anything else, which I'm starting to understand is how she ends most conversations she doesn't want to have twice. Yaren's easier. He shows up at my door before I'm properly awake, already talking, already certain of something he clearly decided overnight. You're going to need someone who knows where things are, he says. Marta knows people. I know things. What's under which house? What's rotted through? Who still has good rope and who's lying about not having it? I don't need you to, though. He says it without arrogance, just fact. You didn't know this village had a second well shaft under the old smithy until I just told you, and I only told you because you were about to ask a question I already had the answer to. He's right, and there's no good way to argue with being right, so I let him fall in beside me instead. First thing I do is put him to work with a scrap of slate and a stick of charcoal, listing every scrap of usable timber left in the collapsed half of the village, every hand willing to lift a beam, every skill nobody's bothered to write down because nobody's asked before. He takes to it like it's the first job anyone's ever trusted him with, which it probably is. The Palisades next. What Ashfall has now is a fence built by frightened people in a hurry 50 years ago and patched by frightened people in a hurry every year since, gaps plugged with whatever was closest, no plan behind any of it beyond keeping the worst of the night out most of the time. I walked the whole ring of it that first full day, nail riding my shoulder, reading it the way I read the beam in the well, not what it looks like, what it's actually doing. That's when I see the lines. They're not really there, not the way stone is there, or timber. But when I look at the well, now closed in its ring of worked stone, I can see something like a thread of light running from it, thin and pale, following the ground toward the wall. When I trace the wall itself, sections of it carry the thread and sections don't. The parts I've touched, even a little, hum with it, and the parts I haven't are just wood. You're seeing it now, Nail says, watching me stare at nothing the villagers can see. The circuit. The what? A structure that closes on itself is worth more than the sum of its parts. Your father used to draw it out on paper for people who couldn't see it themselves, a triangle of lines connecting anything he'd shaped with intent. Close the shape and everything on it holds better than it would alone. He taps his beak against the wall once. Right now you've got one point lit. The well. Build the wall properly, close a shape between the well and a second point, and watch what happens to a wall that used to fall over in a strong wind. I tested on a 10-foot stretch near the north gate first, tearing out the worst of the rotted patch timber and setting new posts the way the reading tells me to set them, angled just slightly against where the ground wants to shift, deep enough to bite past the frost line. When I finish and step back, I can see the thread reach out from the well, touch the new posts, and settle there, faint but real. I put my palm flat against the old section of fence 6 feet further along, the part I haven't touched. It gives under my weight more than it should. I put my palm against the new section. It doesn't give at all. Show me, Yaren says, when I try to explain it to him that evening, slate still in hand. I can't show him, he doesn't have the gift. Nobody in this village does, but I can show him what it does, which turns out to matter more to a village that needs walls, not philosophy. We plan the watchtower next because a wall without eyes is just a taller kind of blind. Old sawn timber from 3 collapsed houses, dragged and sorted under Yaren's count, gets stacked at the site, a rise of ground near the north gate, where a tower once stood and fell, close enough to the well and the new wall section to close a proper triangle if I can finish it. We're 2 days into raising it when Nail comes back from a low pass over the wastes with something in his voice I haven't heard from him yet, not sarcasm. Attention! You should hear this, he says, landing on the half-built tower frame. I've been reading the ground past the ridge. Tracks, mostly old, but layered same paths, walk the same way, over and over, like something's using the same route on a schedule instead of by chance. A schedule. Ashhound scent doesn't sit in dead grass for a month without fading unless something keeps freshening it. There's a pattern under the mess if you know to look for one. I make it once a month, and by the density of what's out there right now, bigger group than the 5 you handled. Considerably bigger, the next one comes before this time tomorrow. Yaren, close enough to hear, goes very still. The night. You've had this before, I say. Every month. Not always this bad. He doesn't say the rest, but I can guess it from the way the others in the yard have stopped what they're doing to listen. Every month this village loses a house, sometimes loses a person, and calls it the cost of living this close to the crack, because nobody's ever given them a better option. I do the math out loud, because it helps to hear it instead of just feel the weight of it. The tower's not finished, the platform's up, but the bracing that would let it hold a proper watch and take a real hit isn't in yet. The weakest stretch of wall, the section I haven't reached, sits close to a gap between 2 collapsed house foundations that funnel straight into the open yard by the well. Less than a day left. Enough time if everyone works flat out to finish the tower properly or to reinforce that weak stretch of wall. Not both. Then we finish the tower, Marta says, when I lay it out for the whole yard that afternoon. Not a suggestion, she's already decided, the way she decides most things, out loud and immediately. A wall with a hole in it is worse than no wall. Close the gap first. I'm not closing the gap. That gets silence, and then it gets louder than silence. You're going to leave it open. Marta doesn't raise her voice, which somehow makes it worse than shouting would. The one weak point in the whole ring, and you want to leave it standing. I want to leave it weak on purpose, in a shape I choose, instead of weak by accident, in a shape the wall picked for itself. I walk them through it while I still have their attention, sketching the ground with a stick the way Yaren sketches numbers on slate, the gap between the two collapsed foundations. Narrowed on both sides by rubble, I can shift tonight into a corridor no wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, opening into a dead end against the smithy's stone back wall instead of the open yard. Anything that breaks through the weak point doesn't get the village. It gets a stone box with one way in. And if they don't break through where you want them to, Marta says, if they come over the wall somewhere else instead, somewhere you haven't planned for because you spent tonight digging a trap instead of building a fence, then it's on me. Not the tower, not you, not anyone standing here. I say it plainly because it's true and because I've learned in 2 days that this village doesn't trust anything said with more polish than that. I'm the one who decided the gap stays open. If it goes wrong because I read it wrong, not because anyone else agreed to something they didn't understand. Marta looks at me for a long moment, in front of everyone, in the kind of silence a village uses to weigh a stranger's whole worth in one look. Fine, she says finally, but you're standing at that gap tonight, not behind the wall with the rest of us. At it. That's where I was planning to be. She doesn't look satisfied exactly. But she turns to the yard and starts giving orders who digs, who hauls stone, who keeps the children in the cellar under the smithy come dark, and for the first time since the gate opened, she's giving those orders with me standing in the circle instead of outside it. Yaren's already moving toward the rubble pile with a length of rope over his shoulder, slate tucked into his belt, counting hands under his breath. Nail settles on my shoulder, coin eyes on the darkening sky where the pattern of old tracks says something is already moving toward us on schedule, the way it has every month for 50 years, except this time there's a shape waiting for it that didn't exist a week ago. Weak point, Nail says, quiet, mostly to himself. Your father used to say the trick isn't building something nothing can break. It's choosing exactly what breaks and where and making sure it breaks in your favor. Did it work for him? Ask me again after tonight, Nail says, and doesn't say anything else. The gap looks smaller once it's dark. That's the trick of it, I realize. Standing at the mouth of the corridor with rubble stacked shoulder high on either side during the day, it was a plan drawn with a stick in the dirt. Now it's just a narrow space between 2 dead houses, and I'm standing in the middle of it with a chisel in one hand and no illusions left about how this goes if I've read it wrong. Behind me, past the funnel, past the dead end against the smithy's stone back wall, I can hear the village settling into position, not hiding. Marta made that clear this afternoon. Nobody goes into a cellar tonight except the very young and the very old, and even the old refused mostly. Everyone else stands along both ropes of rubble with whatever they own that has an edge. Movement, Nail says. He's perched on the half-finished tower, coin eyes fixed on the dark past the ridge, coming faster than the last group. Wider spread. Your 5 hounds were a scouting party, Corvus. This is the pack. How many? More than I can count clean in this light. Enough. I don't ask him to be more precise than that. It wouldn't change what I do next. They come out of the dark the way water comes through a crack, not all at once. A first push, testing, and then the rest, following the path the first one's open. The lead hounds hit the wide mouth of the corridor at a dead run, and for one long breath I think the whole plan is about to unravel because the mouth is wider than I remember drawing it, wide enough for 3 abreast where I'd wanted 2. Then the geometry does what geometry does. The corridor narrows as it goes, funnel-shaped on purpose, and the hounds that made it through the wide mouth hit the choke point single file, snarling, unable to turn without climbing over each other. On both sides, along the rubble walls, the village strikes down at exposed backs and necks pitchforks first, because pitchforks reach further than a hound can lunge, then axes finishing what the forks started. It's not clean. It's not the kind of fight a storyteller dresses up afterward. It's mud and noise and somebody's dog barking itself hoarse from a rooftop where it's been tied for safety, and it works because the shape of the ground is doing half the fighting for people who've never held a weapon like it means something before tonight. Second wave, Nail calls. Sharp now, no room left for commentary. East side, it's not going for the gap. I look east and my stomach drops the way it did at the beam. Something bigger than the hounds is coming around the outside of the corridor entirely low, armored, moving with the deliberate weight of something that doesn't need to funnel through a trap because it's planning to go over the wall instead. Bone plates ridge its spine, catching what little light there is, and it's moving toward the section of palisade I haven't fully reinforced yet, the section that's holding on the strength of the circuit alone, not the strength of the wood. That's not part of the plan, I say. No, Nail agrees. It's part of the ground truth instead, which cares nothing for your plan. I'm already moving up the half-built tower's ladder, 3 rungs at a time, because the tower sits closer to that stretch of wall than anything else in the village, and it's the only high ground I've got. The bone-plated thing hits the wall below, with a weight that makes the whole structure groan, and I can feel through my palms on the ladder rungs exactly how close that section is to failing the circuits holding it together, but the circuit was never meant to survive being hit like a battering ram. I reach the platform. Below me, the beast rears up against the wall a second time, and I can see the crossbeam I set 2 days ago, the one meant to brace the tower's own weight, not to do anything more dramatic than that angled almost directly over where the creature's spine arches as it climbs. I already cut a weak seam into that beam this morning, meant for something else entirely, meant for controlled disassembly if the tower ever needed rebuilding. I didn't plan for this, but the seam is there, and the geometry doesn't care what I originally meant it for. Corvus! That's Yaren, somewhere below, voice cracking on my name. The ropes it's not holding, I set the anchor wrong. I look down at the corridor and my chest goes cold. The lashing that's supposed to hold the near wall of rubble in place, the one Yaren tied this afternoon, the one I checked and didn't check closely enough, has started to slip under the weight of hounds throwing themselves against it from the inside. If that wall of rubble goes, the whole funnel opens sideways into the yard, and every villager standing along that line is suddenly fighting from the wrong side of their own trap. 2 things are failing at once, and I have exactly 1 breath to decide which one I reach for first. I read the rubble wall the way I read the beam at the ruin fast, no time for care, just the shape of what's failing and the smallest true thing that fixes it. It isn't the lashing, it's the angle of the base stone underneath, set a half-degree wrong, letting the whole stack lean instead of lock. I can't get down there in time to fix it with my hands. I don't need my hands. I put everything I have left, everything since the well, since 2 days of work, scraped from wherever it's been hiding since the tower fight a lifetime ago, into telling that stone what it should have been told when it was set. The angle shifts. Not much. Enough. The lean stops. The lashing holds. The cost of it hits me a half-second later than it should, right as the bone-plated thing rears a 3rd time against the wall below, and I turn back to the cross beam a half-breath too slow. I get the angle right. I don't get my arm clear in time. The beam comes down across the creature's spine exactly where the reading told me it would land. Weight and momentum doing what no weapon in this village could have managed, a crack of bone giving way under timber that sounds, for one terrible moment, like the whole tower agreeing with the decision the way the ruin did, days and a lifetime ago. The creature drops, convulses once, goes still. And the trailing edge of the beam, coming down faster than I calculated for a body already running on fumes, catches my forearm on the way past. I don't feel it as pain first. I feel it as absence, my hand not answering when I try to close it around the tower rail. Then, the pain arrives, all at once, and I go down onto the platform boards with my arm cradled against my chest and the fight still roaring below me. Not finished, not yet. It finishes without me doing anything else useful. The last of the hounds break off from the choke point once their numbers thin past whatever animal math decides a fight isn't worth it anymore, and they go back over the ridge the way they came, leaving the corridor littered and the village standing, every house still standing, every person still on their feet. Marta finds me on the tower platform. Sometime later, I've lost the thread of exactly how long between the arm and whatever the reading cost me on top of it. She climbs the ladder without asking permission, kneels next to where I'm sitting with my back against the rail, and looks at the arm before she looks at my face. Broken, she says. Not a question. Feels like it. It'll set. Slower than you'll like. She says it like a fact, not a comfort, which somehow lands better than comfort would have. Then she does something I don't expect. She puts out her hand, palm open, waiting. I take it with the arm that still works. She doesn't shake it the way you'd shake a stranger's hand, or a clerk's, or a warden's. She holds it a beat longer than that, like she's confirming something to herself that she wasn't ready to say out loud an hour ago. Not one house lost, she says. Not one person. 50 years and not once. She lets go. You stood at the gap. You said you would, and you did. Below us, the yard's full of noise that isn't fear anymore, people checking each other for wounds that mostly aren't there, someone laughing too loud from relief, Yaron sitting against the smithy wall looking sick with the guilt of an anchor tied wrong. Until Marta calls down to him that the wall held anyway, and something in his shoulders comes loose. Nail lands on the tower rail beside me, quiet for once, watching the yard the way a thing that's watched 100 years of this kind of night watches one that finally went differently. Toward dawn, once the arms splinted, crooked with what materials the village has, once the dead are dragged clear and the corridor's rubble reset for whatever comes next, I climb back up onto the wall, the same stretch that took the worst of the hit. Scorched black in places from a torch someone dropped mid-fight, still standing. The sun's coming up gray and then less gray, the way it does out here, and Marta's below in the yard, and Yaron's beside her, and 8 people who were ready to bury a 9th stranger a week ago are instead standing in a village that's still whole. I'm not building a wall, I say, mostly to the air, mostly to myself, and Nail's the only one close enough to hear it. I'm building a city. Right here, on top of everything that's supposed to be dead. Bold words for a man who can't lift his own arm, Nail says. I mean it anyway. I know you do. That's the problem with your family, you always mean it, right up until it costs you an arm, and then you mean it harder. He shifts on the rail, coin eyes catching the first real light of the morning. For what it's worth, your father never got this far. Never had a village stand behind him instead of just watching him work. That's supposed to be encouragement? It's supposed to be true, Nail says. Try not to lose the other arm proving it further. The arm sets crooked, but it sets, and by the time the swelling's gone down enough for me to make a proper fist again, Ashfall has visitors. Not attackers. That's the first strange part after a lifetime of the word visitor meaning trouble out here. The first ones through the gate are just tired. A family of 4 walking off land 2 valleys over that a lord decided he wanted back this year. No warning, no compensation, just an order to leave before the frost. Behind them, spread out over the following week, more of the same, a pair of retired mercenaries who ran out of wars worth fighting for and coin to show for the ones they'd already fought. 3 landless farmers whose names I don't get straight before a 4th and 5th arrive needing names remembered too. They've heard somehow, the way word always travels faster than it should through country that's supposed to be empty. Cursed land, dead land, and also quieter, passed mouth to mouth, the way rumors that sound too good to be true usually are a village out there that didn't lose a single house the last time the night came. Marta meets every one of them at the gate personally, and every time, I watch the same argument happen on her face before she opens her mouth. We don't know them, she says to me, the evening the 5th arrives, a gaunt woman with a boy about Yaron's age trailing half a step behind her, both of them looking at the palisade like they're not sure it's real. We spent 50 years learning who to trust by not trusting anyone. That's not a habit I'm ready to break because a few strangers heard a story about a well. You didn't trust me either. A week ago. You fixed the well before I decided anything about you. These people haven't fixed anything yet. They've just walked here. It's a fair point, and I don't pretend it isn't, but I've been turning something over since the second refugee came through the gate, and I say it now because there isn't a better time coming. It was never about where I came from, I say. You didn't let me in because of my name or my papers. You let me in because I did something the village needed. That's the only measure that's ever mattered here, not blood, not a title stamped by someone in the capital who's never set foot past that border stone. What someone can build, what they're willing to defend. I nod toward the gate, toward the woman and her son still standing there, waiting on a decision that isn't theirs to make. Give them the same chance you gave me, something to build, something to defend. Let what they do with it decide the rest. Marta doesn't answer right away. She looks at the woman and the boy for a long moment, weighing something I can't see the shape of, and then she looks back at me with an expression that isn't agreement exactly, but isn't refusal either. If one of them steals from this village, she says, or gets someone killed through carelessness, that's on your judgment, not mine. Same as the gap in the wall. I'll take that. She opens the gate. By the end of the week, Ashfall's population has more than doubled, and the shape of the problem changes from keeping people out to finding enough for everyone to do that isn't sitting idle inside a wall built for a village half this size. Yaren's slate fills up fast names now, not just timber counts, who used to farm and who used to fight and who, it turns out, used to work a forge before the lord who owned it decided he didn't need a blacksmith who argued about prices. That last one is why we start on the smithy. There's a ruined forge at the edge of the village, cold for longer than anyone living remembers. Chimney collapsed, bellows rotted to nothing. What it has, that no other structure in Ashfall has, is proximity close enough to the crack under the well that when I put my palm against the old hearthstone and read what's under it, I can feel the same thread of wrongness that poisoned the water. Thinner here, further from the source, but present. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, Nail says, watching me trace the line of it with my fingers. I might be. Corvus. That is not a stable resource. That is a wound in the ground, and you are proposing to run a forge off it like it's a mill pond. I'm proposing to give it somewhere useful to go instead of somewhere it goes on its own. I've been carrying the idea since the wrongness isn't destructive by nature, the way I first assumed. It's just pressure looking for the path of least resistance. The well ring taught it to bleed sideways into dead ground. There's no reason a properly shaped hearth couldn't teach it to bleed into heat, instead heat a smith can use. Heat that doesn't have to come from cutting down what little good timber this land has left. Nail's quiet for a moment, which from him counts as serious consideration. Say it works. Say you thread a channel from the crack into that hearth and it burns clean and hot, and every tool this village needs gets made twice as fast for half the fuel. What happens to the ground around it every day for a year? It widens, a little, every time we draw on it. A little, said the man who's already broken one arm, underestimating how fast a little adds up. He's not wrong, and I don't pretend otherwise, not to him, not to myself. I lay the true cost out flat that evening, in front of Marta and the two mercenaries turned guards who've taken to standing near her during anything that sounds like a decision. What we have, a crack that's currently stable inside the circuit the well ring already gives it. What it costs. Drawing heat from it day after day widens the danger zone around the forge a measurable amount each season, not fast, not sudden, but real and cumulative, and not something a village can pretend away because the first month looks fine. What it buys. Tools this village desperately needs, made faster and better than trading for them ever could, and eventually goods worth selling to whoever passes close enough to trade. And if it widens too far, Marta says, if your little channel decides it likes being open more than it likes staying where you put it, then I close it the way I closed the well a ring around the forge itself. Separate from the main circuit, so if it ever goes wrong, it's a problem contained to one building instead of the whole village. I've already sketched it in my head, walking the yard that afternoon, a second, smaller loop of worked stone under the forge floor, tied loosely to the main well circuit but able to stand alone if it has to. A safety valve built into the foundation instead of bolted on after. I'm not telling you there's no cost. I'm telling you I've already built the thing that pays it down. Marta looks at the two guards, who shrug in the particular way of men who've decided this isn't their argument to win or lose. Then she looks at me for a long moment, the same weighing look from the gate. You're gonna do this whether I agree or not, she says. I can see it on you. I'd rather you agree, I know. That's the only reason I haven't thrown you back out that gate yet. She turns to go, then stops, half-turned. Small channel, small ring. And you check that safety loop of yours every week, not when you happen to remember. Every week. It takes 4 days to build properly the hearth rebuilt stone by stone with the same care I gave the well, the channel cut narrow and deliberate rather than wide and fast, the smaller containing ring set beneath the floor before a single brick goes up above it. When it's finished and the former smith among the refugees, a broad, quiet man who hasn't said more than a dozen words since he arrived, lights the first fire, the flame that catches isn't ordinary orange. It runs faintly violet at the base, steady, hot enough that he steps back from it in surprise before easing forward again, testing it the way a craftsman tests any new tool, with respect instead of fear. By nightfall, he's forged 3 tools nobody in the village had before. By the following week, word of the forge's strange, steady heat has started traveling the same invisible road the well's story traveled, which means the smithy is already doing something else I didn't plan for as carefully as I should have, making Ashfall interesting to people who aren't refugees at all. That's a problem for later. Tonight the forge is banked low and the yard's mostly quiet, and I'm sitting on an overturned crate near the hearth's warmth with my splinted arm propped across my knee when Yaren drops down beside me uninvited, the way he started doing most evenings. Marta said your father was an architect too, he says. No preamble, the way 16-year-olds ask the questions they've been sitting on all day. Is that where the he gestures vaguely at me, at the forge, at the general fact of everything I've built so far? Is that where this comes from? Some of it. I turn the question over before answering the rest of it, because it's the first time anyone's asked without already knowing the shape of the answer they wanted. He could read a wall the way I read that well. Better, probably. He never got much chance to prove it, though. Nobody wanted to watch a man build things when they could watch someone else burn things instead. That's stupid. It is. Doesn't stop it being true. I look at the forge's low violet glow, at the smith's tools laid out clean on the bench for mourning. He died thinking the gift wasn't worth passing on. I used to believe that too, before I got here. And now? Now I've got a forge running on the same crack that was supposed to kill this village, and 8 strangers who'd have frozen this winter instead sleeping under a roof they helped build. I glance at him. Ask me again in a year. I might have a better answer. Yaren doesn't say anything else for a while, just sits with me in the warmth, watching the last of the day's light go out over the wall we built together with our own hands and a dead man's tools, and for once, neither of us feels any need to fill the quiet with more than that. The arm's mostly good again by the time we start on the canals, though it aches when the weather turns, which out here is often enough to keep me honest about what I can and can't lift. I don't mind the reminder. A man who forgets what a mistake cost him is a man who's due to make it again. The canals aren't complicated the way the forge was no crack to thread, no wrongness to redirect, just water and a village that spent 50 years hauling every bucket by hand from a well that used to poison whoever drank from it. I trace the lines the way I trace the well ring, reading the lay of the ground instead of the ground itself, finding where water wants to go if you stop making it fight you for the privilege. Yaren surveys the fields with a borrowed length of cord and a set of knots he invented himself for measuring distance, because nobody ever taught him the proper way and he wasn't about to wait around for someone to. It takes most of 2 weeks, refugees and villagers working the same trench shoulder to shoulder until the distinction between the two stops meaning much of anything. When we finally open the sluice from the well ring down toward the fields, the water runs clear and steady into ground that's been dust for half a century. And the older among the villagers stand at the edge of the trench, watching it soak in like they're not entirely sure it's not a trick their eyes are playing. It isn't a trick. 3 weeks later, the first green comes up in soil nobody expected to grow anything ever again. The second ring of wall goes up around the same time. Further out than the first, close enough to the growing population that the space between the 2 rings, old wall, new wall, sits mostly empty, except for what people start hauling into it on their own, without anyone telling them to. Stalls at first, a place to lay out what little surplus the forge and the fields are starting to produce. Nobody names it a market, it just becomes one, the way most true things in this village have stopped waiting for permission before they happen. That's what the first caravan finds when it comes through, 6 weeks after the canals, a village twice the size rumor described, with a ring of open ground that's already halfway to being a proper trading floor. They're cautious the way anyone sensible would be, approaching land that's supposed to be cursed a train of 4 wagons, guards riding close, a merchant at the front who introduces himself as Halvard and spends the first hour of his visit looking at the walls more than at the goods. But caution doesn't survive contact with the smithy's work for long. He picks up one of the forge's tools, turns it over, tests the edge against his thumb, and the wariness on his face gives way to something closer to hunger. Where, he says, did a village at the edge of the world learn to work steel like this? We didn't learn it, I say. We built a forge that runs hotter and cleaner than most, and a smith who knows what to do with that. He doesn't ask how the forge runs hotter and cleaner. Merchants, I'm learning fast, care less about the how than about the how much and the how many. And by the time his wagons roll back out toward the trade roads 3 days later, they're carrying half the smithy's surplus and leaving behind coin and goods this village hasn't seen in living memory. Halvard promises to come back before the season turns and means it, I can tell, because he asks Yaren, not me, to confirm the road conditions for a return trip, which means he's already decided this is a relationship worth managing carefully instead of a one-time curiosity. Word of a rich caravan leaving a cursed village travels just as fast as word of the village itself did, and travels toward exactly the sort of ears you'd expect. Nail catches it first, a rider shadowing the departing caravan's dust from well off the road, then a second, then a pattern of tracks that Nail reads the same way he read the Hound Pack's schedule, except this time the pattern says ambush instead of migration. They're not after the village, Nail reports, landing hard on my shoulder as I'm checking the canal gates. They're after the caravan, on the stretch where the road runs along the low fields. Bandits, by the look of the tracks. Enough of them that Halvard's guards won't hold long. I don't have soldiers. I have a smithy's worth of tools, a wall half finished, and a handful of villagers and refugees who've picked up a weapon exactly twice in their lives, once against the hounds, once for practice since. What I do have is the canal system we just spent 2 weeks building, and a road that runs low and dry along the exact stretch where Nail says the ambush is waiting. I explain the shape of it fast, to Marta first because she'll stop anyone who wastes time arguing, then to the dozen or so who can move quickly and swing something sharp. The road's dry because we've been careful about it, kept the canal's overflow contained, routed it around instead of across, so the fields flood and the road stays passable. Tonight, for about an hour, that changes. We reach the sluice gates above the low road with enough daylight left to see the caravan's dust already thinning in the distance, closing on the ambush point. I put my hand against the gate mechanism, read the channel behind it the way I read everything else now: how much water is banked, how fast it wants to move once it's let loose, where it goes if I open every gate instead of one. This is going to be significantly less water than the fields want, all at once, and considerably less warning than the fields would prefer, Nail says. The fields will recover, the caravan won't, if we wait for a better plan. I open the gates. Water hits the low road with a sound like something exhaling, not a wall of it. Nothing dramatic enough for a story, just enough to turn packed dry earth into standing mud within the space of a few minutes, exactly where a line of mounted men are counting on solid ground under their horses. By the time we reach the ambush point ourselves, moving low along the field edge the way Nail scouted it, the bandits are already fighting their own horses more than they're fighting anything else, animals sinking to the fetlock. Riders dismounting in a hurry that cost them the one advantage they had. The dozen of us hit the ones who've already dismounted, and it isn't a clean fight, but it isn't meant to be one pitchforks and hand axes against men who expected an easy robbery and got a swamp and an ambush of their own instead. Halvard's guards, given breathing room they didn't have a minute earlier, turned the caravan's own defense into a second front the bandits didn't plan for. It breaks fast, once it breaks. A handful of riders who kept their horses on firmer ground at the edge of the field wheel and run rather than fight odds that have flipped entirely against them. The rest mired, dismounted, surrounded, start dropping weapons in 2s and 3s, hands up, the particular fast surrender of men who've done the math and don't like the answer. Their leader is the last to drop his blade. Lean, scarred along one side of his jaw in a way that says the scar came from someone who didn't miss, he stands in mud to his shins with a short sword still raised, looking at a dozen farmers and refugees who just beat his crew without a single mage or trained soldier among them. And I watch him actually laugh short, bitter, disbelieving. "A flood," he says. "You beat us with a flood." "I beat you with a road you didn't check before you rode down it," I say. "The flood was just faster than checking." He looks at his men. Half of them already on their knees in the mud, weapons surrendered, the fight gone out of them entirely. Then he looks back at me, and something in his face shifts from disbelief to calculation, the look of a man recounting his odds and not liking the new total any better than the old one. "Drozd," he says finally, and drops the sword. "Name's Drozd, if it matters to you. And it doesn't much matter what I want right now, does it? My crew's finished on this stretch of road either way. Word'll travel that we lost to farmers. Nobody hires a crew that loses to farmers." Marta's face, when I bring this back to her that night, is exactly as unimpressed as I expected. "No," she says, before I've finished laying it out. "Absolutely not. We spent 50 years keeping bandits and worse off this land, and you want me to open the gate and hand them beds. I want you to let me decide what to do with the ones who surrendered instead of running. There's a difference between a man who chose to fight and a man who chose to put his weapon down. There's no difference at all if he picks the weapon back up the first night he decides we're not watching closely enough. Then I make sure he doesn't get that night." I hold her gaze, because this is the same argument as the gate, as the refugees, as every choice this village has made since I walked through it broke, measured by what someone does, not what they were before they did it. I'll take the risk myself. Same as the gap in the wall. If Drozd's people cause harm here, it's my judgment that let them in, and you can hold me to that as hard as you want. Marta doesn't answer right away. She's watched me make this same offer twice now, and I can see her weighing whether a third time cheapens it or proves it. You talk to him yourself then, she says finally, not me. If this goes the way I think it might, I want it clear whose word he answered to. I find Drozd where his surrendered crew is being held under guard near the canal gates, mud-caked, disarmed, watching me approach with the flat wariness of a man who's expecting either an execution or an offer and hasn't decided which he'd rather. Your people can stay, I tell him. Guards, laborers, whatever this village needs that they're fit for. Not because anyone here trusts you, because I'm willing to bet you're the kind of man who keeps a bargain once you've made it, since bargains are the only currency you've got left. And if I'm not that kind of man, then you answer for it, personally. Every one of your crew's mistakes lands on you first, before it lands on them. I let that sit a moment. You keep your people in line, or you don't get to keep them at all. Drozd studies me for a long moment, mud drying on his jaw, the scar along it catching what's left of the evening light. There's no gratitude in his face when he finally nods. I didn't expect any, and I don't need it. Just the particular careful respect of a man who's just been handed the only good option left to him, and knows exactly how good it is compared to the alternative. Fair enough, he says. You've got a deal, architect. Try not to regret it. Try not to make me, I say. And for the first time since the mud and the flood and the fight, something that isn't quite a smile crosses his face. Yaren's slate runs out of room somewhere past the 50 mark, and he has to start a second one, which he complains about like it's a personal insult rather than the best kind of problem this village has ever had. 8, when I walked through that gate. 50-some now, and climbing every few weeks as word keeps traveling roads I've never seen. One well, then a forge that runs on the same crack that used to poison the water, a ring of dead fields turned green. A market that started as empty ground between two walls and now has enough regular traffic that people have started building actual stalls instead of just laying blankets on the dirt. It should feel like winning. Most days it does, but a village that size stops being one thing held together by fear of the dark outside the wall and starts being a lot of different people who don't automatically agree on anything, which is its own kind of weather to learn to read. Drozd and Yaren can't be in the same yard for more than a few minutes without it turning into something. It starts small. Drozd overseeing a work detail near the second wall, Yaren coming through with his slate to check material counts, and Drozd waving him off like he's a fly instead of the person keeping track of every plank and nail this village owns. I don't need a child telling me how many posts I've got left, Drozd says, loud enough that half the yard hears it. I can count timber, boy. You can count it wrong then, because your crew's already used 11 more than what I logged out this morning. Yaren doesn't back down, which is either bravery or stubbornness, and at 16, those two things aren't always easy to tell apart. Maybe if bandits kept better books, you wouldn't have needed to rob caravans for a living. It goes downhill fast from there, not blades, nothing that serious, but enough shoving and enough shouting that half the market stops to watch, and by the time I get there, Drozd's got a fistful of Yaren's shirt and Yaren's got a fistful of Drozd's. Both of them red-faced and past the point of caring who's technically right. Marta gets there before I do. She doesn't shout, she doesn't need to. She walks between them, grabs each by the ear like they're 8 years old instead of 16 and whatever Drozd actually is, closer to 30 than 16, and hauls them apart with a grip that neither of them, for all their pride, tries very hard to fight. You, she says to Drozd, spent years robbing people for a living, and somehow that's not the most embarrassing thing you've done today. And you, this to Yaren, are supposed to be the one keeping records, not starting fights over them. He started it, Yaren mutters, rubbing his ear the second she lets go. I finished what he started, Drozd says, which earns him another sharp look from Marta that makes even a former bandit leader take half a step back. I don't care who started what. I care that half the market just watched the two people this village needs working together instead act like children fighting over a toy. She looks between them, unimpressed in the specific, withering way that's become her default expression around most disagreements. You'll count timber together tomorrow, both of you, until you can do it without an audience. Neither of them look thrilled by the sentence, but neither argues with it either. which tells me Marta's authority in this village has grown roughly as fast as the population has. They'll come around, I say to her afterward, more hope than certainty. They'll come around because I'll make them, she says. Hope's a poor substitute for supervision in my experience, but there's something almost fond buried under the dry delivery, and I've started to recognize it as her particular way of admitting she cares more than she lets on. The real trouble arrives 2 days later, and it doesn't come through the front gate. Draw's people know roads this village never had reason to learn old smuggling paths, back trails, the kind of routes a bandit crew uses to move unseen. It's the same reason I agreed to keep them, and it pays off faster than I expected. One of Draw's scouts comes in hard off a ridge trail at dusk, horse-blown, with word that a column's moving this way from the east, not raiders, not monsters. Men in a lord's colors, riding under a banner nobody in Ashfall has seen in living memory, because nobody's had reason to. Baron's colors, Drozd says, when I bring him in to look at the description the scout gives. Svenild, if the banner's right, owns half this side of the map on paper. Not that he's ever once ridden out to look at what he owns. Why now? Because now there's something on his land worth riding out for. Drozd says it flat, like it's the most obvious thing in the world, which to a man who spent years reading exactly this kind of greed for a living, it probably is. A village that pays no rent because it doesn't officially exist is one thing. A village trading tools that make merchants happy enough to leave gold behind is a different thing entirely. Somebody's tax collector heard about that caravan architect. Word like that doesn't stay quiet. I look at Nail, who's been listening from the fence rail with the particular stillness he saves for things he takes seriously. He's not wrong, Nail says. I've been reading the roads the same as Drozd's people. There's traffic on the eastern trade route that wasn't there a month ago. Money draws attention. Attention draws men with banners. Marta's jaw sets when I bring it to her, not fear, something harder than fear, closer to a very old and very tired kind of anger. 50 years this land was worthless to every lord who owned it on paper. The moment it stops being worthless, suddenly someone remembers he owns it. That's exactly what's happening, Drozd says. You'd know, Marta says. Not quite an insult. Not quite not one either, and Drozd, for once, doesn't rise to it. 3 days' ride east, in a manor hall too large for the handful of servants left to keep it properly warm, Baron Svenild reads a report twice before he lets himself believe what it's telling him. It's the tax collector's writing, careful and a little too eager to please, describing a settlement on the border of the Ashen Wastes, the same tract of ruined ground his grandfather wrote off half a century ago as not worth the ink of a formal deed. Wells that run clean, fields that grow. A forge, of all things, turning out tools fine enough that a merchant train left 3 wagons lighter and considerably richer in trade goods after a single visit. Peasants, the Baron says to the empty room, though his steward is technically still standing near the door, have decided my land is worth farming again, and it never once occurred to a single one of them to send a portion of the proceeds to the man who actually holds title to it. The wastes were never formally settled, my lord, the steward offers, carefully. The prior survey listed the territory as I know what the prior survey listed it as. I read it before you were old enough to hold a pen. The Baron sets the report down with more force than the paper warrants. 50 years of a worthless ledger entry, and the one season it stops being worthless, it's some upstart with delusions of a title collecting the benefit instead of him. Send Aldrich. Full complement, enough to make the point without wasting a real garrison on farmers. He collects what's owed, half of everything built on my land, retroactive to whenever this nonsense started, or he brings back whoever's calling himself in charge out there, in chains, so I can explain the concept of ownership to him personally. And if they resist, my lord? The Baron looks at his steward like the question barely deserves an answer. They're farmers, he says. They fixed a well. They didn't raise an army. Send Aldrich. Back at the gate, Drozd's scout is still catching his breath when I finish laying out what we know to Marta, Yaren, and the dozen or so who've become, without anyone officially naming it, the closest thing Ashfall has to a council. How long, Marta asks, before they arrive? A week, maybe less, if the column's already moving the way the scout says, Drozd says. Then we've got a week to decide what kind of village we are when someone with a banner tells us we belong to him, Marta says, and looks at me not for permission exactly, but for whatever comes next, the way the whole village has started looking at me since the well, since the night, since the flood on the low road. I don't have an answer yet. What I have is a week, a growing wall, a forge, a market, and a village of 50-some people who've already decided, one crisis at a time, that they'd rather build something worth defending than keep surviving on nothing worth anyone's attention. That's going to have to be enough for now to start planning with. A week isn't long enough to build a wall that stops a lord's men outright, but it's long enough to stop pretending the palisade is anything but a first draft. I go back to my father's chisel marks in my memory instead of guessing this time the old habits of load and angle that got me through the well and the forge, refined now into something closer to what he must have actually drawn on paper, back when anyone still let him draw. A proper stone wall this time, not scavenged timber. Foundation dug below the frost line the way Yaren's cord and knot survey says it needs to be. A gate mechanism built on counterweights instead of brute muscle, so two people can raise or drop the main gate as fast as 10 could with rope alone. That part isn't guesswork at all. It's a design I can feel in my hands like I've built it before, even though I never have. Because somewhere in what I inherited from a man I barely knew, this shape was already waiting. Watchtowers go up at 3 corners of the new wall, each one carrying a brazier ready for a signal fire, each one tied into the well circuit the same way the first tower was, so the whole ring hums faintly with the same thread of strength once the last stone locks into place. The market gets a real building at last, a long, low warehouse at the center of the space between the old wall and the new one, where the loose stalls have finally earned themselves a roof and a ledger. Yaren runs the ledger. Nobody assigned him the job. He simply started keeping it, and nobody's found a reason to take it from him since. We're 2 days from finishing the main gate when Aldrich's column comes over the ridge. Not the full garrison Drost feared, but enough riders in the Baron's colors to make the point without wasting real soldiers on farmers, exactly as intended. I meet them at the unfinished gate myself, Marta on one side, Drost on the other, close enough to the wall that the men riding in get a clear look at stonework that shouldn't exist on land their lord's family wrote off 2 generations ago. Aldrich is younger than I expected for the job, sharp-featured, carrying himself with the particular stiffness of a man reciting words he didn't choose. By order of Baron Svenild, rightful holder of this territory, he announces, loud enough for the whole gathering yard to hear, all improvements made upon his land are subject to claim. Half of all goods, structures, and stored wealth are to be surrendered as owed rent, retroactive to the date of first settlement. Behind me, I can feel the yard go tense. A season's worth of work, half of it demanded in a single sentence by a man who's never set foot here before today. Drost's hand drifts toward his belt. Marta's jaw sets in the way I've learned, means she's holding back words that would make this considerably worse. I don't argue, I don't raise my voice. Half, I say, of what exactly? Aldrich blinks, thrown slightly by the question instead of the expected protest. Half of everything built, the wall, the forge, the stores in that warehouse, as specified. Then let me show you what half actually means here before anyone signs anything. I gesture toward the gate, toward the village beyond it. I'd rather the Baron's own man see it firsthand than take my word for the count. I walk him through it myself, not as a prisoner being paraded, but the way you'd walk a guest through a house you're proud of, because pride, I'm learning, unsettles men expecting fear far more than defiance does. The well, still running clear. The forge, its low violet flame drawing a careful, professional stare from Aldrich that he doesn't quite manage to hide. The fields, green where they should be dead. The warehouse, Yaren's ledger open on the counter, showing exactly how much of what's stored there is already promised to Halvard's caravan for the next trade run. Exactly how much is seed and tool stock the village needs to survive the coming winter. Exactly how little is anything resembling surplus wealth sitting idle for the taking. Half of the wall, I say, once we're standing back at the gate, is stone we quarried and set with our own hands, holding back things that would otherwise be killing everyone inside it. Half of the forge is the only reason this village has tools at all. Half of what's in that warehouse is already spoken for, feeding people through winter or paying debts to the one merchant willing to trade with a village his own lord spent 50 years pretending didn't exist. I let that settle before I go on. There isn't a version of half here that doesn't mean starving this village to make a point. I don't think that's what the Baron actually wants. I think what he wants is proof this land is worth something to him now, that it's worth something to someone. Aldrich doesn't answer right away, which tells me he's smarter than his opening speech let on. What would you propose instead, he says carefully. the tone of a man who suspects he's about to be handed something he can actually carry back that doesn't end with him explaining a failure. A fixed rent, set in coin or goods, agreed each season, paid on time, every time, whether the harvest's good or bad. Not a portion of whatever we happen to have built by the time someone rides out to check. A number the Baron can count on, instead of a number that has to be estimated and argued over every single visit. I keep my voice level, reasonable, the voice of a man offering a deal rather than resisting one. That's the kind of arrangement a lord can put his name to and look wise for having made. Half of everything, whenever I feel like collecting it, is the kind of arrangement that makes him look like he doesn't understand what he actually owns. I watch it land. Aldrich isn't a fool. He can see the difference between a report that says the peasants refused outright and a report that says the peasants offered a structured tribute more generous, in practical terms, than the Baron's own demand would have yielded once the numbers were actually run. I'm not authorized to agree to terms, he says, finally. I'll bring this back to the Baron myself. That's all I'm asking. He looks past me once more at the wall, the towers, the warehouse, the general shape of a settlement that's grown considerably beyond anything his lord's report described, and something in his expression shifts from official duty toward a private, unspoken calculation of his own, the look of a man who's just realized the story he's about to carry home is more complicated and more impressive than the orders he rode out with. The column turns and rides back east without collecting a single coin, a single tool, a single stone, which means to anyone counting the way Baron Svenild will count it, that a village of farmers just sent his tax collector home with nothing. He'll be furious, Marta says, once the dust settles and the gate crew goes back to work like nothing happened, which by the standards of the past week, almost nothing did. Probably. You didn't give him a single thing to be angry about, though. That's what'll make it worse. There's something almost like approval in the observation, dry as always, but real underneath it. That evening, once the gate crews called it for the day and the yard's gone quiet in the particular way it does when a threat's been deferred rather than resolved, Marta finds me at the edge of the warehouse and hands me something wrapped in oiled cloth, worn soft at the corners from handling. I've had this since the week you came through the gate, she says, before I can ask. You gave it to me for safekeeping, back when you still weren't sure you'd survive the night, and I never got around to giving it back. Didn't read it either, if that's what you're wondering. Wasn't mine to read. I unwrap it slowly. My father's journal, the same one I carried out of the capital and handed to her, half conscious with exhaustion, in those first uncertain days, trusting a stranger's hands with the one thing of his I had left, because I didn't trust my own to keep it safe through everything I was about to attempt. You could have read it, I say. I wouldn't have known. I'd have known. She says it simply, like the idea of doing otherwise never seriously occurred to her. Sit down. If you're finally opening it, you're not doing it alone at midnight where nobody can talk you out of whatever's in there. We sit against the warehouse wall, lantern between us, and I open pages I've been carrying unread for longer than I want to admit. Some of it's exactly what Nail described: diagrams, half-finished, margins crowded with corrections in a hand that gets steadier the further into the book you go, as though the drawing itself was where he thought most clearly. A design for a gate mechanism not unlike the one we just finished, except his notes trail off mid-sentence, where mine would have kept going. A sketch of a wall section with a question mark instead of a measurement, like he ran out of certainty right where I would have needed it most. He was close, I say. Quiet, mostly to myself. To some of this. Closer than I realized. Close isn't the same as finished, Marta says, not unkindly. You finished the gate. He only drew it. Doesn't feel like much of a difference some nights. It's the only difference that matters. She taps the page, the unfinished sketch, with one blunt finger. He drew a door he never got to walk through. You're the one standing in the doorway now. That's not the same man failing twice. That's a son finishing something, which is a different story entirely, whether you're ready to believe that yet or not. We stay there longer than either of us probably means to, working through page after unfinished page by lantern light, and for the first time since the well, since the night, since every argument we've had at every gate this village owns, I don't feel like I'm proving myself to her anymore. I feel like I'm simply sitting beside someone who's already decided some time back exactly which side of this she's standing on. The answer comes back inside 2 weeks, and it isn't the answer Aldrich's report was supposed to earn us. Drozd's scouts spot the column 3 days out bigger this time, mounted men in mismatched armor that says hired rather than sworn, moving with the loose discipline of a company that's fought plenty of frightened villages and never once lost. No banner leading them. That's Drozd's read on it, and it's not a comforting one. No colors means the Baron doesn't want this one written down as his order, Drozd says. Standing at the map, Yaren's drawn of the whole settlement, every wall, every street, every building that's gone up since the well. Mercenaries. Paid to burn a lesson into you that a lord's own soldiers might balk at delivering. How many? Enough that a straight fight loses us the village. Not enough that a fight on our terms doesn't stand a chance. He looks at me, and for the first time since the mud and the flood, there's something almost collegial in it, not friendship, not yet, but the specific respect of one tactician sizing up another. You've got 2 rings of wall and a market's worth of streets between them now, architect. Time to find out if all that stonework is worth more than just keeping the weather out. I've been thinking the same thing since the scouts' report came in, and by the time the column's close enough to see the smoke of our chimneys, the plan's mostly built not on paper, the way Aldrich's tour of the village was built on showing the truth plainly. This time the truth stays hidden, and everything the enemy sees instead is a lie built out of stone. The main gate, the real one, counterweighted, solid, stays shut and unremarkable, guarded lightly enough to look like an oversight rather than a decision. A false gate, hastily built into the old first ring where a section of palisade used to stand open, gets left invitingly ajar, leading into a stretch of the market district we've spent 2 days reshaping without the mercenaries ever seeing it happen. Streets that used to run straight now bend at angles that all look identical from horseback. 2 lowered iron grates, salvaged from the old smithy and rebuilt into working portcullises with Yaren tracking every measurement, weight ready to drop the moment the right numbers pass beneath them. The genuine route to the village center, the well, the forge, the warehouse, everything worth protecting twists through 3 false turns before it ever opens onto anything real. You built a maze, Marta says, walking it with me the evening before, out of a village people actually live in. I built a maze that looks exactly like the village people actually live in until you're standing in the wrong part of it. I checked the last great mechanism, the ropes clean and ready. That's the difference that matters. The company hits the false gate at dawn, exactly the way I hoped a company with no local knowledge and no patience for a siege would straight through the inviting gap, mounted men fanning out to secure the district before whatever resistance the village mounts can organize. There isn't any resistance waiting for them, not yet. Just empty streets that all look the same, and a village gone quiet in a way that unsettles men expecting screaming and panic instead. I watch from the second tower, close enough to read the shapes of the company, as they split a rider commander shouting orders that send groups of 4 and 5 down different bending streets. Convinced they're covering ground efficiently when in fact they're doing exactly what the maze wants them to do. Spreading themselves thin across a shape none of them can see the whole of. Now, I say, and Yaren, next to me, hauls the first rope. The nearest portcullis drops behind a group of 6 riders who've just committed to what looks like the direct route toward the center, sealing them into a dead-end street with walls too high to climb quickly on horseback and only one way back out straight into whatever's waiting for them there. What's waiting is Drozd and a dozen of his old crew turned village guard, and a stretch of narrow street deliberately built too tight for 6 horses to turn around in. It isn't a clean fight, the same way the night wasn't clean. It's shouting and crowded chaos, and horses screaming in a space too small for them, and Drozd moving through it with the particular economy of a man who's done exactly this kind of ambush from the other side more times than he probably wants to admit. The 6 riders don't die. That's not the plan, and Drozd sticks to it even when a blade comes close enough to open a shallow line along his forearm. Disarm, not kill, because a dead mercenary tells no story to the rest of his company, but a disarmed one, marched out at spear point in front of his own comrades, tells exactly the story I want told. Across the district, the same thing happens. Twice more groups funneled by streets that all look identical until they aren't, met by villagers and refugees who know every false turn because they helped build it, disarmed instead of slaughtered, herded into a widening cluster of men who've stopped fighting because there's nothing left in this maze worth fighting for. The company's commander, a broad man on a gray horse, still shouting orders that fewer and fewer of his men are in a position to follow, finally reins up hard in the market square's outer ring, surrounded on 3 sides by villagers holding weapons steady, his own scattered men disarmed and standing in loose knots behind them. This is a farming village, he says, disbelief edging into his voice. It was, I say, stepping out where he can see me clearly, You're welcome to report back exactly what it is now, once you're done being escorted out of it. He looks at what's left of his command more than half disarmed, none dead, the numbers not remotely in his favor anymore, and does the sensible thing a paid professional does when the job's stopped being worth the fee. Stand down, he calls loud enough to carry. Weapons on the ground. By midday it's over, and not one body needs burying on either side, a fact that seems to unsettle the mercenaries more than a bloodier defeat would have. Several of them, once the commander's ridden off with what's left of his authority intact but his pride considerably diminished, quietly ask Drozd whether Ashfall's hiring instead of just defending. You'd work for a village that just humiliated your own company? Drozd asks one of them, not unkindly. I'd work for the village that beat us without killing anyone, the man says. Says something, that does. Drozd looks at me across the square, and there's something in his expression I haven't seen from him before, not calculation this time. Something closer to the beginning of pride in a thing he's actually helped build rather than merely survived inside of. Baron Svenild receives the report 3 days later, and this time he doesn't read it twice, hoping the words will change. A full company, he says, very quietly, to a hall that's emptied of everyone except the unfortunate messenger who rode the news back, surrendered to farmers. Without a single casualty on either side. The commander reports the settlement's defensive layout was unusually sophisticated, my lord. Streets built to disorient, mechanisms to trap. I don't care what it was built like. I care that I sent a paid company to teach peasants a lesson, and the peasants taught the company a lesson instead, and now every lord within 3 days' ride is going to hear exactly how that went. The Baron's hand closes hard enough on the arm of his chair that the wood creaks. He'd wanted this handled quietly. Humiliating the collector was one thing, embarrassing, but survivable. This is a different order of failure entirely, the kind that invites questions from people whose opinion actually matters to a man holding a title. He writes to the capital himself that night, not to report a defeat. Pride won't allow that particular honesty, but to request, in careful and self-serving language, that the Crown's engineering office look into irregular fortifications on his territory that may represent a risk to regional stability. It's meant to draw attention to me, to paint the village as dangerous rather than simply well-defended, a threat worth the Crown's concern rather than a lord's embarrassment worth hiding. What it draws instead, once the letter reaches the right desk in the capital and gets passed along by clerks more curious than obedient, is precisely the kind of attention he never intended. A settlement that's brought a portion of the long-dead ashen wastes back to productive life, built fortifications sophisticated enough to defeat a professional company without bloodshed, and sits according to the oldest survey maps still in the Royal Archive. Maps nobody's cross-referenced properly in decades, directly above what those same old records call a branch line of a much larger, much older network of sealed passages running beneath half the kingdom. The engineering office takes notice. So, in a much quieter room, in a much older building, does someone who has spent 50 patient years making certain that particular branch line stayed open, and who reads the Baron's complaint with considerably more interest than the Baron ever intended anyone outside the Crown to take in it. Back at Ashfall, none of us know yet what the Baron's letter has actually set in motion. What we know is simpler, and for one evening, good enough to sit with. The wall held, the maze worked, nobody died, and a man who spent his whole life being paid to hurt people like us is walking around this village asking Drozd, of all people, whether there's honest work available instead. 2 humiliations in a month, Marta says, watching the last of the disarmed mercenaries settle into a makeshift camp inside the outer ring, more guests now than prisoners. He's not going to let a third one go quietly. No, I agree, he's not. You don't sound worried. I'm not worried. I just don't think worrying about what he does next changes anything about how well we build in the meantime. I look at the wall, the maze, the streets Yaren mapped, and Drozd's crew turned into a trap that worked exactly as drawn. Every time he underestimates this village, it gets a little harder to underestimate the next time. That's worth more than worry for now. Marta doesn't argue the point. She just watches the yard settle into its evening rhythm, smoke from the forge, voices from the market, a village that stopped flinching every time hoofbeats sound on the ridge and lets the quiet do the arguing for her instead. The full ring goes up over 3 weeks, and it isn't like anything we've built before. Where the second wall was stone laid with care, this one is stone laid with intent, a complete circuit, closing all the way around the settlement for the first time, tying every point that's ever glowed faintly in my sight into a single unbroken shape. I can feel the difference the moment the last course locks into place near the north gate, a hum that isn't quite sound, running the whole length of the wall at once like something finally exhaling after holding its breath for a season. "That's new," Nail says, perched on the fresh stone, coin eyes narrowed at something only the two of us can see. "What is?" "You're not just drawing strength from the circuit anymore. You're feeding it back into the wall, directly a trickle of what the crack itself puts out, routed clean through the ring instead of around it." He sounds almost impressed, which from Nail is a rare enough thing that I actually stop and pay attention. Small cracks in the stonework are closing on their own. I watched one do it an hour ago and assumed I was seeing things. I don't see things. I test it myself that evening, running my palm along a stretch of wall I know took a hairline crack from a mercenary's abandoned battering attempt weeks back. The crack's gone. Not patched healed, the stone knit closed the way a well-set bone knits, slow and steady, drawing on the same thread of power that used to just poison our water before we taught it a better use. The town hall goes up next, at the center of the market district, and it's the first building in Ashfall that isn't built to defend or produce anything, just to organize the people who now live behind that wall in numbers approaching 200. Yaren stands in the middle of the half-finished frame the day it's raised, ledgers under one arm, looking like he's not entirely sure he's allowed to be standing there. "Guild of Stores and Supply," Marta announces, in front of the whole gathered crew, with the flat, official tone she uses when she wants something to be taken seriously immediately and not questioned later. "Run by Yaren, effective today. Anyone with a grievance about materials, rationing, or trade takes it to him, not to Corvus, not to me. He's earned the desk." Yaren doesn't say anything for a long moment, just stands there, holding his ledgers like they've suddenly gotten heavier, and then he nods once. Sharp, the way you nod when you're trying not to let your face do something embarrassing in front of a crowd. Under three of the largest new buildings, the town hall, the warehouse, the forge, we dig storage cellars deep enough to double as shelter, reinforced with the same careful stonework as the wall above them, each one tied faintly into the greater circuit. Not because I expect to need them tomorrow, because a village this size, sitting on a crack that's fed us as much as it's threatened us, doesn't get to assume the worst has already happened. It's Drazid's people who find the reason those cellars might matter sooner than any of us hoped. One of his old crew, a wiry woman named Ilsa, who's taken to scouting the newer refugee arrivals as a matter of quiet habit, flags a man who came in with a group of farmers 8 or 9 weeks back, quiet, useful, unremarkable in every way except that Ilsa's noticed he asks careful questions about the well and the forge that don't match the questions a farmer would think to ask. Could be nothing, she tells Drozd. Could be a man who's just curious about magic he's never seen before. Could be, Drozd agrees, and doesn't believe it for a second, and neither. Once Drozd brings it to me, do I. We don't drag the man out publicly. That's Nail's suggestion first, and it's a good one. A village that's just started feeling safe doesn't need to watch a witch hunt unfold in its own market square on nothing but suspicion. Instead, we set a trap the way Nail and I set most things now, quiet and specific. Drozd mentions, loudly enough for the suspect to overhear during an evening shift change, that the well's containing ring is due for maintenance the following night and will be briefly unguarded while the stonework's checked. It isn't true. There's no maintenance scheduled, but it's exactly the kind of opening a man watching the crack for someone else would find impossible to pass up. He takes the bait before midnight, moving toward the well with careful, unhurried steps that say he's done this kind of thing before, and finds Drozd, Nail, and me already waiting in the dark instead of an unguarded ring. He doesn't fight. That surprises me more than it should. A spy caught cleanly usually tries something, but this one simply stops, hands loose at his sides, and looks at the three of us with an expression that's less fear than a kind of tired resignation. "You knew," he says. "We suspected," I say. "You confirmed it well enough just now. We don't touch him." That's a line I set before Drozd even asked, and Drozd, to his credit, doesn't argue it. There's a difference, I tell him, between defending a village and becoming the kind of thing this village was built to survive. What we do instead is talk, carefully, patiently, laying out for him exactly how much we already know or can guess, letting the gaps in our knowledge look smaller than they are, until the man Tobin he finally offers. Like the name costs him something to give up, decides the safest path left to him is honesty. What he tells us, over the better part of that night, isn't the story I expected. The crack under Ashfall was never an accident, and it was never simply neglected. It's been tended deliberately for 50 years by a cult that calls itself the Hollow Communion, kept open on purpose, fed carefully enough to stay stable rather than catastrophic, because whatever their god is, whatever it wants, it feeds through cracks exactly like this one, and a sealed crack starves it. 50 years ago, Tobin says, not meeting my eyes now, there was a warden here. An actual one sent by the crown, same as they've sent since, except he wasn't running from a title or hiding from a family. He came because he wanted the work. He had a gift for reading structures, same as you've got. He nearly finished a permanent seal on the crack before anyone in the communion realized what he was building. I feel my chest go cold in a way that has nothing to do with the night air. They killed him, Tobin says. Made it look like the land itself did it, a collapse, a monster attack, something the survivors could believe and grieve and eventually stop asking questions about. The seal died with him, half finished. The communions kept the crack tended and quiet ever since, waiting to see if anyone would try again. His name, I say, though I already know the answer before I finish asking. Vantry, Tobin says. That's the name in the old reports, if that means anything to you. It means everything. It means the man who died in a rented room 3 winters back, disowned and unmourned by his own family, wasn't the first Vantry this land ever took from me. It means the reason Ashfall was written off as cursed, the reason this whole stretch of country was struck from every map 50 years ago, was never that the land was broken beyond saving. It's that the one man who might have saved it was murdered before he could finish, and everyone since has simply inherited the lie that it couldn't be done. Marta's found us by the time Tobin finishes talking, drawn by voices at an hour the village should be silent, and I watch something move across her face when she catches the name, not surprise, recognition. I knew him, she says. Quiet, and it's the first time I've heard her voice do that particular thing. Go soft around an edge she's clearly kept sharp on purpose for a very long time. I was a girl when he came through. My mother used to say he was the only warden who ever looked at this land like it was worth saving instead of worth abandoning. She looks at me now, really looks, the way you look at someone once you finally understood the whole shape of why they're standing in front of you. You look like him. I didn't want to say it before. Didn't seem fair to either of you, comparing a living man to a memory. He was my grandfather, I say, and the words feel strange in my mouth, a fact I've owned for less than an hour and already can't imagine not knowing. Nobody ever told me how he died, only that he did, and that the family decided the gift died with a reasonable enough excuse to bury alongside him. Then finish what he started, Marta says, simply, like it's the only sane response available to any of us. Whatever comes next, because of tonight, you finish it. For him, if not for the rest of us. Tobin, still under guard, still watching us with that same tired resignation, speaks again before Drozd leads him away. There's more you should know. The communion isn't planning to wait quietly this time. They've made contact with what's left of the Baron's mercenaries, the ones who weren't hired back after your maze humiliated them twice over. Men with a grudge and no other paycheck are easy allies for a cult that promises both. He hesitates, then adds the rest, like it costs him the last of whatever loyalty he had left to give up. They mean to hit you from 2 directions when they come. An outer assault on the walls, loud enough to hold every eye and every weapon on the surface. And underneath it, a smaller group heading straight for the crack itself to finish what 50 years of patience is owed. Who leads them, I ask? Moore, Tobin says, High Warden of the Communion, though I've never once heard him use a title that plain in front of the others. I've never met him myself, only carried word for those who have. But everyone who has met him says the same thing about him, more or less. That he's very patient and very certain he's owed something the rest of the world keeps refusing to give him. That night, once Tobin's secured under watch and the yard's gone quiet again, I sit with Marta and Drozd at the edge of the unfinished cellar beneath the town hall, and we make the decision that costs the most to make and the least to explain. We don't tell the village, I say. Not yet. Not the spy, not the communion, not any of it beyond the 3 of us and whoever needs to know to prepare properly. They deserve to know what's coming, Drozd says, though there's no real fight in it, more testing the shape of the argument than making it. They deserve to survive what's coming, Marta says, before I can answer. Panic doesn't build better defenses, it just makes people slower to trust the ones already in place. She looks at me. You keep this quiet. We prepare loud more drills, more supplies moved into those cellars, more urgency in every task, all of it explained as simple caution instead of certainty. When it comes, the village fights as well-drilled strangers to the truth as it would fight knowing every detail. Better, maybe. Fear that has a shape is worse than fear that doesn't until the moment the shape actually arrives. I don't love the decision. I make it anyway, because every argument against it costs more than the one for it, and because somewhere underneath the tactics, there's a simpler truth I'm not ready to say out loud to anyone but myself. My grandfather died alone here, unfinished, betrayed by a land that swallowed the truth about him along with his body. Whatever comes for this village next, it isn't going to finish the same way twice. The night before it comes, the three of us end up on the wall without quite planning to. Yaren finds me first, Ledger left behind for once, just leaning against the stone with his arms crossed the way he does when he's tired, in a way sleep won't fix. Draws joins a few minutes later, unasked, and neither of them starts anything, no jab about slate counting, no complaint about bandit manners. Just three people looking out at a village that shouldn't exist. Quiet in the particular way people go quiet the evening before something they can't take back. Feels strange, Yaren says after a while, standing up here not arguing with him. Don't get used to it, Draws says. But there's no heat in it, just the dry shape of a joke neither of them needs to laugh at for it to land. Nail settles on the rail between us, coin eyes on the dark line of the ridge where, somewhere out past sight, an army we can't count yet is closing the distance on a schedule none of us chose. Well, he says, in the tone he uses when he's decided a moment deserves marking and refuses to admit it plainly. Let's see. One well, closed and running clean. One forge, running hotter than any smithy for 3 counties, and not once burned this village down doing it. Fields that grow food instead of dust, a market that trades with strangers instead of hiding from them. A wall, a proper one, whole, closed all the way around, healing its own cracks like it's got half a mind of its own. A guild office with a 16-year-old running the books better than most grown men manage. A former bandit standing guard duty instead of running one. He pauses, just long enough that it doesn't sound like an accident. 8 people, when you walked through that gate, better than 200 tonight waiting on you to hold what you built. Nobody says anything for a moment. It isn't the kind of thing that needs an answer. That a compliment? I ask eventually, mostly to break the quiet before it gets heavier than any of us can carry into tomorrow. It's an inventory, Nail says. Try not to read more into it than that. But he stays on the rail longer than he needs to, and none of us move to leave first, and for one evening that's as close to a blessing as this village is going to get before the sky starts turning the wrong color with torches on the ridge. They come at dawn, the way these things always seem to, as if the people planning them share some unspoken agreement that daylight makes cruelty feel more official. The outer force is bigger than anything we've faced Aldrich's earlier column, and the failed mercenary company combined and reinforced, men with a grudge and a paycheck marching under a banner the barons finally stopped hiding. Because pride's given way entirely to the need to be seen doing something about the village that's humiliated him 3 times running. The wall holds the first hour on stonework alone. I can feel it through my palm pressed flat against the gate mechanism, every strike against the ring answered by that same faint healing hum, cracks closing as fast as siege hooks and improvised rams can open them. But stone only buys time, it doesn't win a fight by itself, and by the second hour they've brought up ladders enough to threaten 3 sections at once. Drozd commands the wall like he's spent his whole life waiting for a fight worth fighting properly, instead of one worth running from moving along the ring, directing former bandits and refugees and farmers with a voice that carries over the noise without ever quite shouting. Reading where the pressure's building faster than the defense can answer it, and shifting people there before I'd have seen the need myself. I see him take the wound from the tower, mid-morning, when a section near the east gate nearly buckles under a concentrated push, and he goes down into the thick of it personally, rather than send someone else to hold a line he's not certain will hold. A blade catches him low on the side, deep enough that even from a distance I can see it change how he moves, and for one terrible second I think the wall's about to lose the one person holding this whole defense together by sheer force of presence. He doesn't go down. He wraps a strip of someone's torn shirt around the wound himself, one-handed, and keeps directing the line like the injury's an inconvenience rather than a crisis, and the section holds. By midday, the outer assault has settled into something grinding rather than explosive pressure and counter-pressure, the wall giving ground in inches and taking it back in the same, a fight that's going to be decided by whoever runs out of will first rather than by any single dramatic moment. That's when Nail drops onto my shoulder hard enough that I nearly lose my footing on the tower ladder. Below, he says, and for the first time since I've known him, there's no dry edge in his voice at all. The old cellar tunnels under the smithy, the ones from before your father's time, the ones we never fully mapped, something's moving through them. Fast. Heading straight for the well shaft. The diversion. Exactly the shape Tobin described, and exactly the moment I'd hoped wouldn't actually arrive while the surface fight was still balanced on a knife's edge. I find Drozd and Yaren both, fast, at the base of the tower. Drozd, pale from blood loss but upright, Yaren white-knuckled around a spear he's clearly still getting used to holding. They're going for the core, I say. I have to go down there, now. The wall needs you up here, Drozd says, immediately, the objection of a commander who's spent all morning trusting my presence as much as my planning. The wall's holding because of what I already built into it, not because I'm standing on top of it. I look between them, and I make the choice that's been sitting half-formed in the back of my mind since Tobin's confession, the one I haven't been ready to say out loud until exactly this moment. The two of you hold the surface. Together. Not split into sections that don't talk to each other together, the way you should have been working since the maze, since the tax collector, since always. I trust this wall to you both more than I trust it to me, trying to be in two places at once. For half a second, I watched the old instinct flicker across both their faces, Drozd's readiness to argue that a bandit doesn't need a farm boy's help, Yaren's flash of doubt that anyone would trust him with something this large. Then it passes, quick as it came, because there isn't time left for either of them to indulge it, and something settles between them instead that looks, for the first time, like an actual partnership rather than a truce. Go, Drozd says, we'll hold it. We'll hold it, Yaren echoes and means it in a voice steadier than I've heard from him before. I go. The tunnels under the smithy are older than anything I've touched since I arrived, rough-cut stone, unshaped by anyone's gift, carved by hands that predate my grandfather by generations. I follow the thread of wrongness down through them the way I followed it through the well shaft that first night, except now the thread isn't thin and hidden, it's a current, pulling toward a source I can feel getting closer with every step, like heat off an open flame. I find the diversion team before I find the core itself, 5 cultists, robed in dull gray, working fast at a section of old stone with tools that aren't tools at all, more like instruments meant to unmake rather than build. Nail dives ahead of me without waiting for instruction, a blur of iron plate that scatters 2 of them before they even register the attack, and the rest turn on me with the particular, unhurried confidence of people who don't expect a single man to matter much against what's coming. They're wrong about that, though it costs me to prove it. I don't fight them the way Drozd fights. Blade to blade, I read the tunnel around us instead. The same way I read the ruin on the first day, the same way I've read every wall and beam and stone since, and I bring down a section of unsupported ceiling exactly where 2 of them are standing. Time to the half-second it takes them to commit to a strike they think I can't answer. The other 3 break and run rather than face whatever just proved it could drop a roof on command, and I let them go, because chasing them isn't the fight that matters. The core chamber opens up ahead of me sudden and vast, a cavern I never knew existed directly beneath the well I've been tending for months, walls scarred with cracks running deep and wide, the same wrongness I've been carefully bleeding into a forge and a containing ring. But here raw and enormous and utterly unbound. Something moves in the center of it. Not a hound, not anything with a shape that makes sense against the animals I've fought before, a guardian thing, born of the crack itself, limbs that shift between solid and something closer to smoke, eyes that don't track me so much as simply know exactly where I am at all times. It comes at me before I have time to plan anything more elaborate than survival. What follows isn't a fight the way the tower was a fight, or the corridor, or even the maze. It's construction under fire. I read the chamber the way I've never had to read anything, fast enough that thought and action stop being separate acts, throwing up stone barriers between one heartbeat and the next, not to keep the guardian out, but to shape where it can and can't move. Funneling it the way I funneled the hounds in that very first fight, except now the walls rise and fall in seconds. Instead of being built over a careful day, each one a decision made and executed almost simultaneously. It corners me once, a limb of smoke and stone catching my splinted arm and sending fire up through the old break that never fully healed, and for one long, ugly second I think this is where it ends, alone under my own village with no one close enough to help. Then I see it the same kind of thing I saw in the beam at the ruin, in the beam on the tower, in the rubble wall, the night the hounds nearly broke through. A true thing, small and specific, in the chaos of a fight too large to read all at once. The Guardian isn't a creature bound to a body. It's bound to the crack itself, tethered the way the wrongness in the well was tethered before I gave it somewhere else to go. I stopped trying to fight the Guardian directly. I start building the tether a different shape instead. I don't fight the Guardian anymore. I build around it instead. The tether holding it to the crack is a shape, same as the beam at the ruin was a shape, same as the failing rubble wall the night of the night was a shape, and shapes can be moved if you understand what they're actually doing instead of what they look like they're doing. I stop trying to strike the thing in front of me and start reading the line that runs from its center down into the raw wound in the chamber floor, and I set stone against that line the way I set stone against the well's poisoned thread months ago, narrowing where it can move, tightening the radius it's allowed to occupy, one desperate half-formed wall at a time. It slows. Not stopped, slowed, forced into a tighter and tighter turn as the space I'm carving around it shrinks, until it's circling instead of striking, caught in a spiral of its own tether with nowhere left to spend its reach. That's when the footsteps come, unhurried, down the same tunnel I came through. A man in gray robes, older than I expected, moving with the calm of someone who's never once had to run from anything in his life. He stops at the chamber's edge, watching the Guardian circle its narrowing cage with something between curiosity and mild disappointment, and when he finally looks at me, there's no surprise in his face at all, only the particular satisfaction of a man confirming a theory he's held for a very long time. "Vantry blood," he says, like he's reading it off a page. I wondered when the reports started coming in about a village that stopped losing houses. I wasn't certain until just now, watching you do that. He nods at the Guardian, at the tightening spiral of stone. "Your grandfather did something very similar the night we finally stopped him. Different chamber, same instinct. You're more. High Warden, if titles matter to you. They don't matter much to me anymore. 50 years tending one crack teaches a man how little most titles are worth." He steps further into the chamber, unbothered by the caged, circling thing between us, like a man walking past a dog he's long since stopped fearing. "I'll be honest with you, since honesty costs me nothing at this point. I came down here fully prepared to kill you the same way we killed him. Quietly, efficiently, another Vantry lost to a land that eats its architects, and no one left to ask hard questions about why. And now I find myself curious whether you'll break the same way he did once you understand the shape of it." He tilts his head, studying me the way he might study a wall he's deciding whether to knock down. He believed, right up until the very end, that this land was worth saving. Died believing it, in fact, with the seal half finished under his hands and my knife already in his back. 50 years, boy, and nothing he built survived him. Not the seal, not his name, not even his own family's memory of him. Once we made certain the story told afterward was simpler than the truth. You're standing exactly where he stood, making exactly the mistake he made, and I promise you the ending doesn't change just because the blood in it is younger. I could answer that with words. There's a version of me, the one who walked out of a convict's wagon with nothing but a sack of tools and a dead man's bird that might have needed to. But I've spent the better part of a year learning that the only answers this land actually respects are built, not spoken, and I already know exactly what I'm going to build. You're wrong about one thing, I say, and I let the stone I've been quietly setting around the whole chamber, not just around the Guardian, finish closing while he's busy enjoying the sound of his own certainty. Moore's smile falters, just slightly, when he feels it, the same faint hum I felt the day the outer wall closed its circuit, except now it's running through this chamber too, through tunnels he assumed were simply forgotten passages and not, in fact, the last unfinished section of a ring I've had every villager quietly extending for weeks under Yaren's supply lists and Drozd's patrol routes, disguised as ordinary tunnel reinforcement against exactly this kind of diversion. My grandfather tried to seal one crack, alone, in one night, with no one behind him, I say. I didn't build a seal. I built a city. Every wall out there, every wound in this ground I've spent a year teaching to bleed somewhere useful instead of somewhere deadly, it's all one shape now. And you just walked into the middle of it thinking you'd found an unfinished tunnel instead of the last piece of a trap 100 people have been building around you without ever knowing it. The Guardian, still circling its shrinking cage, suddenly has nowhere left to circle. The narrowing spiral I built specifically for it collides with the wider ring closing around the whole chamber, and for one violent grinding moment the two shapes fight each other instead of fighting me. Stone and Shadow Limb straining against a containment that's no longer just mine, but the whole village's, poured into the ground over months of careful, unglamorous work that never once looked like war until exactly this second. Moore understands what's happening a half-breath before it finishes happening, and for the first time since he walked into the chamber, something that isn't calm crosses his face. "This isn't possible," he says. "One man does not seal a wound this size, and one man didn't," I say. "A city did." The Guardian loses its fight against the collapsing spiral all at once, shadow limbs collapsing inward, drawn back down the same tether that bound it here in the first place, except now that tether has nowhere to go but back into the crack itself. Forced along a path I've spent this entire fight narrowing until there's no other direction left available to it. It goes down with a sound like something enormous exhaling, the same sound the sluice gates made on the low road the night we flooded a bandit ambush, except vastly larger, vastly older, and final in a way that road never was. Moore doesn't run. I think, afterward, that he genuinely doesn't believe it's necessary until the closing ring reaches him too, and by then there's nowhere left in the chamber that isn't already claimed by stone he never saw being set. He goes still, finally, boxed into a corner of his own diversion tunnel by walls that rose while he was busy explaining in great and patient detail exactly why I couldn't possibly win. 50 years, I say, standing over a man who killed my grandfather in a chamber very much like this one, and finding, to my own quiet surprise, that I don't need to raise my voice to say it. You spent 50 years making sure nobody finished what he started. You're not spending a 51st. I don't kill him. That's a decision I make in the same breath as everything else, not out of mercy exactly, but because a village that's learned to disarm mercenaries instead of slaughtering them doesn't stop being that village the one time the stakes get personal. What I do instead is leave him exactly where the walls put him, boxed and bound, for Drazid's people to collect once the surface fight finishes, deciding itself, which, by the sounds carrying faintly down through the tunnels above, it already has. Above ground, the third wave never gets the chance to be the disaster it should have been. The outer force, already exhausted from a full day grinding against a wall that kept healing faster than they could break it, finally commits everything it has left in one last push near dusk and finds, waiting behind the gate alongside Drazid's guard and the mercenaries who switched sides weeks ago, every able-bodied refugee this village ever took in without asking where they came from first. I hear about it afterward from Yaren, who tells it with the particular pride of someone who watched something happen that he genuinely didn't expect to see. The same people who cowered behind a shut gate the night I arrived, the family that walked off land 2 valleys over, the retired mercenaries who'd run out of wars worth fighting, the farmers with no names I could keep straight that first week stand the line not as frightened strangers sheltering behind other people's courage, but as a garrison defending the only home most of them have had in years. Nobody breaks. Nobody runs. The push that was supposed to finish the siege in one decisive stroke instead breaks itself against people who've spent months learning exactly what this village is worth to them. By the time I climb back up out of the tunnels, arm throbbing, exhausted past any measure I've felt since the tower fight, the fight outside is already over, not with a dramatic final blow, but with an enemy simply running out of will against a village that never once ran out of its own. Baron Svenild rides in himself 3 days later, alone, without a single guard, which tells its own story before he says a single word. He finds me at the gate, the real one, whole, healed of every scar the siege left on it, and dismounts slowly, an old man's care in the motion that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with the particular weight of arriving somewhere as a supplicant instead of an owner. My mercenaries are gone, he says, without preamble, without the practiced authority he wore through Aldrich's letters, scattered or working for you now, from what I've heard. My alliance with the Communion cost me whatever remained of my reputation the moment word got out that I'd partnered with a cult to burn a village of farmers. and the Crown's engineering office has apparently taken a very personal interest in the fortifications I once described in a letter I deeply regret writing as an irregular risk to regional stability. That's a great deal of consequence for one bad decision. It's a great deal of consequence for several bad decisions, stacked one on top of another, each one seeming reasonable at the time. He looks past me at the wall, the market, the town hall, the whole shape of a city that didn't exist a year ago on land his own family wrote off as worthless 2 generations back. I'm here because there isn't a version of this that ends well for me otherwise. I'd rather surrender what's left of my claim on my own terms than have the Crown strip it from me on theirs. I don't gloat. There isn't any satisfaction in it, watching a man arrive at the end of his own pride with nothing left to bargain but the truth. The Crown's already made its decision then. The Crown's engineering office has recommended, and I understand the recommendation is likely to be adopted without much debate, that this territory be formally recognized under a new warden's charter. He says the word like it costs him something, which it does. You. Officially. Not a title stamped by a family ashamed to give it to you. One earned in front of witnesses who'll swear to every part of it. I think about a sergeant on a wagon, dropping chains in the snow and telling me nobody would come back for the body. I think about a woman on a wall demanding to know why I hadn't turned around yet. I think about a boy with a slate, a bandit with a debt to repay, a village of 200 people who fought a siege as a garrison instead of scattering as strangers. I didn't do this for a charter, I say. No, the Baron says, something almost like respect in it now. Hard-won and unwilling, but real. I don't imagine you did. That's rather the point, isn't it? Spring comes gentler than any season this land's had in 50 years, and I spend the first clear morning of it walking the whole city on foot, slow, the way you walk somewhere you built rather than somewhere you're passing through. I start at the well because everything else started there too. The ring of worked stone I set that first desperate night, hands raw, Yaren watching from the shadows deciding whether I was worth trusting. It's older stone now, weathered. Settled into the ground like it's always belonged there instead of like something a stranger scraped together out of desperation and a dead man's tools. Someone's planted flowers around the base of it. I don't ask who. It doesn't need an answer. The market's full this morning, the way it's full most mornings now. Stalls that used to be blankets laid on bare dirt have become proper storefronts, voices haggling in at least 3 accents that didn't exist in this village a year ago. Children weaving between legs on errands that have nothing to do with survival and everything to do with simply being children somewhere safe enough to allow it. Halvard's caravan is due again within the week, according to the boards Yaren keeps posted outside the guild hall, and half the stalls are already setting aside goods against his arrival like it's the most ordinary thing in the world for a merchant to keep faithfully returning to a village his own guild once called cursed. The forge is next, its low violet flame banked steady behind the smith's careful hands, the small containing ring beneath the floor checked, as promised, every single week without fail. I stop at the doorway long enough to watch him finish a blade for one of Draw's guards, and he nods at me the way he's nodded at me for months now, not with reverence, just the simple acknowledgement of one craftsman toward another whose work he respects. The town hall stands at the market center, and Yaren's at his desk in it, exactly where he's been most mornings since Marta gave him the title in front of the whole gathered crew. He's not a boy with a slate scratching down timber counts anymore. The desk in front of him is real wood, the ledgers real leather-bound volumes instead of scraps. And there's a line of 3 villagers waiting patiently for his attention with the kind of respect nobody in this village would have handed a 16-year-old a year ago. Guilds balanced for the season, he tells me, not looking up from the figures in front of him, though there's a note of pride under the business-like delivery he doesn't quite manage to hide. Surplus enough that we could take in another 20 families before winter and still have grain to spare. I've already flagged 3 families on the eastern road who've been asking after us. You don't need my approval for that anymore. I know. He finally looks up, and there's something steady in his face that wasn't there the night he handed me stones by lantern light, guessing the pattern of a ring he couldn't see the way I could. Just like you knowing, I suppose. I leave him to his ledgers and find Drazd at the wall's north gate, overseeing a drill with the particular patient thoroughness of a man who takes his second chances seriously. He's slower on that side since the siege the wound never quite healed the way a clean cut would have, and he favors it without ever mentioning it, the same stubborn way I favor my own crooked arm on cold mornings. His guards move through the drill with a discipline that would have been unthinkable from a crew of former bandits and farmers a year ago, and he watches them with an expression I've come to recognize as pride, even though he'd never once call it that out loud. "City's soft this morning," he says, by way of greeting, nodding at the market noise drifting over the wall. "Won't stay that way if we get lazy about drills. You've run this crew every morning for 2 months straight, and I'll run it every morning after this one too." He glances at me sideways, the old wariness long since worn down into something closer to genuine regard. "Wasn't sure, that first week after you took my surrender, whether I'd ever be anything here but the bandit you were kind enough to tolerate." Marta made sure I knew exactly how thin that tolerance was, more than once. And now half this city calls me captain and means it. He says it plainly, without the old bitter edge, and something in the set of his shoulders when he says it looks, for the first time since the mud on that low road, entirely at peace. Wasn't sure what a place like this could offer a man like me. Turns out the answer was simple: somewhere worth standing for. I find Marta last at the council chamber built onto the side of the town hall, where the closest thing this city has to a governing body meets 3 times a week to argue over things far more mundane than sieges and cults, grain allotments, road repairs. A dispute between 2 families over a shared fence line that's apparently been simmering since before either of them arrived. She's presiding over the fence argument when I arrive, settling it with the same flat, unimpressed authority she once used to settle a fight between a bandit and a boy with a slate, and it takes her all of 2 minutes to have both parties shaking hands and looking faintly embarrassed for having wasted the council's time. "City's got real problems now," she says. "Once the chamber's cleared and it's just the 2 of us. Small ones. Petty ones. Fence lines and grain counts instead of monsters at the gate." She says it like it's the finest compliment she's ever paid anything. That's what winning actually looks like, in case nobody's told you. Not banners and songs, just people arguing about fences because they're alive enough to have the argument. You run this whole council like you've been doing it your whole life. I have been doing it my whole life, in a smaller way, since long before you walked through that gate. This village needed someone to hold it together with nothing but stubbornness for 50 years before you gave it something better to hold together with. She looks at me for a long moment, the same weighing look from that first refusal at the wall, except there's nothing left to weigh now. Not really. The Crown's letter arrived this morning officially. Warden's charter, sealed and signed. They're calling the settlement Vantry's Reach, if you're wondering. Wasn't my choice. Seemed the Crown thought it had a nice sound to it, given the history. I don't know what to say to that, so I don't say anything for a while, and Marta, who's never needed me to fill every silence, doesn't push. "He'd have liked this," she says, eventually, quiet. "Your grandfather." I only knew him a season, when I was young enough that most of what I remember is probably more feeling than fact. But I remember him saying once that this land wasn't cursed, just unfinished, something somebody hadn't gotten around to loving properly yet. She nods toward the window, toward the market noise, the forge smoke, the whole living shape of what used to be 8 frightened people behind a shut gate. I'd say somebody finally got around to it. I climbed the north wall alone that evening, the same stretch I stood on the morning after the night, scorched black in places back then, whole and healed now, humming faintly under my palm with a thread of strength that belongs to the whole city rather than to any one person's effort. Nail lands on the rail beside me, uninvited as always, and for a while neither of us says anything, just watching the light go gold and then gray over rooftops that didn't exist when I first saw smoke rising from this same spot and thought it might be the last friendly sign I ever saw. "Went and did it then," Nail says finally. "Rebuilt a city with your bare hands on a graveyard. Very stupid plan. Told you so back at the start? You did. I was wrong to call it stupid. I'll admit that much, since apparently I'm feeling generous tonight." He shifts on the rail, coin eyes on the darkening market below, lanterns lighting one by one in windows that used to stand empty and dark for 50 years running. "For what it's worth, your father never built past a forge he wasn't allowed to light. Your grandfather never finished a seal he died defending. You've got both their names on you now, and neither of them ever once got this far. That's supposed to be a compliment again?" "It's an inventory," Nail says, exactly the way he said it the night before the siege, and there's something almost warm underneath the dry repetition of it. Try not to read more into it than that. I let the quiet hold a while longer. Arm resting on stone, I set myself the very first night, looking out over a market and a forge and a town hall and a wall that closes clean and whole around every single thing this place has become. 50 years, a land struck off every map in the capital, called cursed because nobody stayed long enough to prove it wasn't. A grandfather who tried and died for it. A father who never got the chance to try at all. They didn't fail, I say, mostly to myself, mostly to the last light going out over the rooftops. They just didn't get to finish. Below, the city keeps its evening rhythm smoke from the forge, voices from the market winding down into the ordinary business of people going home for supper, a guard changing shift at the south gate with nothing more urgent to report than a quiet night ahead. No banners on the ridge, no riders shadowing the trade road with anything worse than the honest business of merchants. Just a city standing where nothing was ever supposed to stand again, holding steady under its own weight the way I built it to. I finished it. That's the whole of what matters, standing here at the end of it, not a beginning of something larger waiting past the horizon, not a threat gathering somewhere out of sight for another day. Just this, a city that wasn't supposed to be, standing exactly as tall and exactly as whole as it was always meant to. I built it to stand. It's standing. That's enough.